There's so much news in this past week, and we really should be sitting down and talking about Justice Kennedy. And if the world doesn't blow up, we might talk about that on Thursday. But I promised you Bernie Sanders, so today we're going to get Bernie Sanders. Very little changed the enthusiasm, the scope, and really the rhetoric surrounding the 2016 presidential election than out of left field, out of nowhere candidate Bernard Sanders, or Bernie as he's called by his fans. Now, prior to 2015, the name Bernie Sanders had really never been heard. Bernie wasn't really one of those rock star congresspeople that everybody talks about, and the elite few congresspeople that make all of the decisions, or at least all of televised appearances. But in New England, the name was pretty well known. Bernie Sanders was an independent Vermont senator and had been since 2007. He'd been elected in actually while I was living in that region. And prior to that, he had been a long-time mayor of the city of Burlington. Bernie Sanders was an independent senator and an independent representative when he served on both houses in our Congress. He generally caucused with Democrats, but when he decided that it was time to run for president, he shocked the world by not running for third party, as most people expected him to when he started talking about the premise of it, and instead he ran as a Democrat. He ran as the key Democrat challenger, even though most people at the time in 2015 thought he was going to be a long shot and he'd never even be taken seriously. Now, there are a few things about Bernie Sanders that I want to touch on while I'm talking in this video. And there are a few other factors on the outside that I'd like to talk about in further videos, and other factors that I've already talked about in my previous video talking about Hillary Clinton. But I want to come out and say directly this. Bernie Sanders is the reason that the Democrats lost the 2016 presidential election. That is one of the things that I am most sure about at the time that I'm making this video. And that's going to be both in what I've studied and what I just outright observed during that election season. Now, before we can sit and talk about Bernie Sanders and why he rose to prominence, first we have to take some time and look at the Democrat Party itself, because that's a big reason that he rose to prominence, and that's also a big reason as to why that party lost the 2016 election for the executive branch. Now, when you take some time and look at both major political parties in the United States today, you'll see that it's not just a black and white, this is what one believes and this is what the other believes. Both parties are split off into a number of other factions, and they come together under a blanket belief in the way that our Constitution should be run. The Republican Party is split among a few factions, and I'm just going to give out a couple of examples. You have your religious Christians, you have your fiscal conservatives, you have your libertarians, and you have the Tea Party, or Taxed Enough Already. All of these groups have a different idea as to how the government should be run, but they all come together under the blanket idea of representative democracy, that people from each district should elect a representative to come forward and represent their ideas, and the district should choose the representative that most closely identifies with the majority of people in that district. The Democrat Party, on the other hand, has many different factions in it, but there are two major ones that have been at play over the last 16 years in politics. There is the Union Worker Democrat wing, also known as the Classic or Blue Dog Democrat wing, and the wing of the Democrat Party. Both wings come together under the umbrella that we should just throw every vote into a big pot throughout the entire country, or at least in a specific region, and the majority or the mob should rule. I have dabbled in almost every single faction of both parties that I've mentioned before. I grew up in a Union Democrat household and supported the candidates that I was told to support by the Union Democrats, even though I was pretty much red-pilled by the time I became an adult. But I have also taken some time and looked at the benefits that work on paper for communism and socialism. And for a while when I was younger, not thinking of the individual, I was able to look down on the paper and realize how on paper it can work, even though it could never be fully implemented in a society such as our own. For almost as long as I could remember, the Blue Dog Union Democrat wing of the Democrat Party was the one that maintained the control of the party. The other wing was considered to be far too extreme for any sort of mainstream politics. And when you look at the Union Democrats, you see that they are still a free market, open capitalist society. They just participate in other sorts of activity to try and make everything fair for everybody who's voting for them. Unions are big in factories, and it is true that when you work under a union in a factory, if Jerry can make twice as many widgets as Jeffrey can, Jerry's not going to be rewarded specifically for his production and his output. But union workers are rewarded in a different way. Jerry, who is probably going to put 40 years into the factory that he works in, making twice as many widgets as Jeffrey, and Jeffrey is going to be spending the majority of his time sitting around picking his ass because while he can be fired, and probably will eventually, it does take an act of God under most union contracts. So he's just going to bilk out as much money as he can before he gets fired, and then go on and do the same thing at another company. And Jerry is going to get rewarded handsomely, and he's going to wind up with a massive wage by the end of his 40-year run. Jeffrey, on the other hand, is going to be bouncing around at the minimum contracted wage of the various unions he's going to work for throughout those same 40 years of his life. So the Union Democrats do still hold values to the individual and individual contributions, and I still think that's a good thing. And that's why I had no problem supporting them while they were the faction that was in power of the Democrat Party. But in 2007, the movement started, and the other wing of the Democrat Party started to take hold. I want to take some time and talk about Barack Obama and the way that he changed the face and the balance of the two factions in the Democrat Party, but I will take some time and talk about that next week when we talk about Barack Obama himself. But I do want to say this when I come out to talking about Bernie Sanders, and that is, like I mentioned in the Hillary Clinton video, Barack Obama laid out the groundwork for a socialist wing of the Democrat Party to take hold. And in the back of the Senate hall where the independents that don't really belong with either party go, there sat Bernie Sanders looking at the opportunity that he was intending to jump on. Now, one of the things to remember about Bernie Sanders when you start to look at him from an objective point of view is the fact that Bernie ran as an independent because for the majority of his political career, Bernie Sanders' ideas were considered to be entirely too extreme even for the socialist wing of the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party and the DNC wouldn't put their support behind him in his senatorial run as well as his House run and his mayoral run. In 1980, when Bernie Sanders first ran for mayor, the Cold War was still going on. The wall was still up, and the evils of Russia were still fresh in everybody's mind. Russia was still the Soviet Union at that point, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as they're properly known. Communism and socialism were still the enemy. Therefore, a person who would want to run on such a wild idea just really couldn't get the backing of anybody mainstream. Yes, it was nice and it was easy for him with his concepts of wealth redistribution and immense social programs to take over the mayorship of a small town. Yes, it was easy for him to spread his ideas and look everybody in the eye and say, yes, I will guarantee you a paycheck and a social program if I can't guarantee you a paycheck, in a 38,000 person town where he could walk around and look everybody in the eye. He didn't have to come out and say, I am a socialist. He could just say he was an independent and start promising free things out. Now, the records show that Sanders did a pretty good job of running the city of Burlington and was a pretty massive upset when he defeated the incumbent mayor. But it's a little surprising then that afterwards, when he ran his first time for the U.S. House, that he was defeated. However, he pulled another great political upset the following election and defeated the same incumbent that defeated him 2 years prior to win that seat, which he would stay in throughout the rest of the 80s and 90s. In 2005, when Jim Jeffords said that he was not going to seek re-election for his Vermont Senate seat, Sanders then decided to switch Congress houses and ran for Senate that same year. In 2015, Bernie Sanders decided to round out all federal elected positions that he could run for and decided he was going to run for president. Sanders came in with a history of political upsets behind him. He surprised the people of Vermont when he was able to walk away with the election from incumbent Gordy Paquette, and the 1990 win against Peter Smith was a shock to the nation, as Sanders had lost to the same incumbent 2 years prior in the same election. Now, there are a lot of people out there that believe that Bernie Sanders just went into the electorate to shake things up and to energize the voting base to go out and get the Democrats elected, and I do not believe that is true. He followed a pattern that doesn't show any of that. He followed a pattern that really goes out and showed that he was out there to win and win alone. Having served as an independent for almost his entire political career, Bernie Sanders came out and said that he was going to run for the Democrat nomination for president rather than an independent side or a third party. And that's the first key where I believe that he was really out to win. And the stage was really set for Bernie to come in and win, too. The mostly moderate candidate, Barack Obama, that had preceded him, had gone further and further to the left and further into a socialized way of life with welfare and Medicare for all. And that really set the stage for a redistributionist campaign that Sanders ran. And Sanders really did run a redistributionist campaign. It was one of the things that pushed him along as far as they did. Sanders was well known for excoriating the 1%, saying that their needs had to be sacrificed in order to meet the needs of the majority of the people. A lot of what he said was the majority, and he was able to stir up the mob and the mob rule that ran around this country. And he had a message that rang onto a lot of ears, especially young people going up as far as my age. Once you started getting a little bit older than me, it was starting to get harder and harder to get people on board for Sanders, but especially people from ages 18 to, at the time, 32, were eager and willing to let Sanders implement his utopian universal plan, no matter what it would mean for anybody else. Bernie Sanders being able to energize a lot of very young voters is actually nothing new in Democrat politics. The Democrats have always been able to go and get their message across to very young people, people that are in college and very slightly after. Winston Churchill once said that if you're not liberal when you're young, you have no heart, and you're not conservative when you're old, you have no brain. I don't necessarily agree with that, but there is some of that sentiment that you see in modern-day politics. Sanders was well known for saying that no young people had jobs waiting for them when they got out of college, that all young people would still have to live at home with their parents, that nobody was going to be able to get a job. Unfortunately, his solution for rectifying that was by enacting more job-killing regulations. Regulations that most of the people that were in business, older than me, or just in general had an understanding of the way that economics worked, saw right through. But in spite of all of that, he was able to energize a very, very vast majority of young voters, and essentially the majority of Democrat voters, with so many of the older voters having lived under Obama and tried to get jobs and were ready for a different kind of governance than the Democrats were. Bernie's ability to energize young people speaks more to Democrat strategy than a lot of people are willing to admit. But what it also did was it opened up a rift in the Democrat Party that had always been there, but it was in a place where Democrats of both the union working wing and the socialist wing have always been able to work together, because they both wanted to have a Democratic majority rule. But unfortunately for Bernie, and ultimately for Hillary, the onset of the Bernie Sanders campaign and his appeal to young people started infighting among Democrat voters who would have normally been united in order to keep the evil Republican from going into office. And it had a very unexpected twist at the end that I started to see as the generals were coming closer and closer. After 8 years of Obama, Bernie Sanders had the real message that the people on the left wanted to hear, and it was the message that was further and further to the left than anything that Hillary could have provided. And while the message of free healthcare, free college, and free everything else for all was able to resonate in many of the more coastal states that were going to be depending on the tax money from flyover country in order to fund themselves, it fell on dead ears a lot in middle America. I don't think Bernie Sanders would have been elected president if he'd have been given the nod. But I do think that the map would have been a lot more purple than it was at the end of the Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton election cycle. Now, I don't want to talk very much about the DNC email scandal, because I'm still in the process of reading the Inspector General's report. But I know from news sources and from some of the things that I have read in the IG report, it is clear that Hillary Clinton essentially stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders. There are people out there that say that the DNC changed the rules so that Hillary Clinton would be guaranteed the nomination. And I don't know enough about DNC rules from prior to that to know whether or not that's true. That's something I would have to research more. But unfortunately, the news outlets spouted that line so often that I think a lot of America and a lot of the older millennials started to believe it. And one of the things that did was it led to a great distrust of Hillary Clinton, and I think it led to a lot of revenge votes that went to Trump that would have otherwise gone to Clinton. Now, it's impossible to know exactly how many Trump voters were Sanders voters in the primaries, how many people defected from the Democrats when they knew that Hillary was going to be the nominee. I have seen reports ranging all the way from 5% all the way up to 15%. And Bernie Sanders took away a huge amount of votes in the general election. I think the last count that I saw, it was almost 1.1 million votes went to Sanders across the country. But there is one thing that I know, because I know a lot of people that work in the private and the union sector, that you're not going to see reported anywhere on the news, especially when you walk around middle America. There were a lot of Obama voters out there from middle America, and these are the Union Democrats, that either abstained from voting or voted for Trump. When Hillary started losing to Bernie, she started to move her platform closer to his. And that was going to be a big knife in the back if she were to carry out her platform to all of the Union Democrats that would have voted for her. Sanders would have never been able to implement a full government takeover of the means of production in our country, even though that would have been his dream given his socialist platform. But in spite of that, he would have been able to run a platform that pulled more wages away from people that were working harder in taxes and put them towards people that didn't want to work. The people of Canada and Norway and Denmark and Sweden will all tell you, in free market societies with heavy social programs, the elites and the business owners are not the people that are paying the most of the taxes for the social programs that help everybody else. That is coming right off the back of the middle class. And in the United States, in that middle class, there are a lot of white-collar workers, but for the most part, that middle class is made up of the Union Democrats that voted for Bill Clinton and that voted for Barack Obama on his first term. In 2008, an election between Blue Dog Democrat Hillary Clinton and reality TV star Donald Trump would have been a runaway for Clinton. But with 8 years of socialist policy coming from the Obama administration and Bernie Sanders spouting off his redistribution tactics, there was a definite change in the political landscape. And that was a change in the political landscape that made it almost impossible for Hillary Clinton to win. It's important to note when you look at the 2016 presidential election that it had one of the lower voter turnouts in recent history. While politics has become such a big part of mainstream life and in our mainstream culture, there was just no energy for either of the candidates that made it onto the ticket. And a lot of that is because we didn't know what we were going to be getting out of either candidate. As I mentioned last week, Hillary had absolutely no platform, and Donald Trump had never been in politics, so we had no idea how he was going to be voting. Bernie Sanders had a specific platform, and it was a specific platform that appealed to a lot of people, and when he was turned away from the nomination, it was a betrayal to a lot of the potential voters that were out there. And it's between that betrayal of Bernie Sanders and the people of Middle America who ultimately did reject the socialist and redistribution tactics of Bernie Sanders, knowing that it was going to be coming right off of their backs. The Democrat Party was tainted and shattered and needs some time to rebuild. I have no doubt that Democrats are going to come back into power in my life, but they're not going to do it if they keep moving onto that extreme wing of their party. If Democrats want to win in 2020, it would behoove them to go back to a Clinton or JFK-esque blue dog Democrat and put him up for the presidential office, rather than trying to find somebody who is more and more extreme to the left and more in the Sanders camp. Unfortunately, I believe that the Democrats have already decided who they are going to run for president in 2020, and they're just keeping hush-hush about it. The DNC has already changed their rules, so somebody cannot come from the outside and run on the ticket. That is something that would bar Bernie Sanders from running on the Democrat ticket, obviously, but by those same rules, someone from the outside like Oprah Winfrey, whose name has been tossed around as the Democrat nominee, would also be barred from running for president. And the other side of that part of the election is the fact that the candidates who have been in Congress forever, who may have already been very far to the left but hiding it in order to get votes, have come out and become very open about it. They're very open about the fact that they want to raise their taxes, and they use those words, they want to raise your taxes. And they're very open and adamant about the fact that they need to change the way the wage structure works and the way that your health care works, further than Barack Obama did. While they may have rejected Sanders, they have definitely moved into being the party of Sanders. And Bernie is going to influence that party for years to come, unless they come to a stark realization that it's not going to win them elections across places like Wisconsin and Montana. It's scary to think that Bernie Sanders really did cost Hillary Clinton the 2016 election, especially knowing the fact that he would have given Trump a legitimate run for his money across the country otherwise, had he become the nominee. What did you think watching Bernie Sanders go through and campaign and change the face of the Democrat Party? Would you have voted for him? Would you vote for him in the future? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, or especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlogTwitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this show and support this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care, everyone.